Number 1. Robert Pickton, the pig farm killer. Robert William Pickton operated one of the most horrific killing grounds in Canadian history on his sprawling pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, transforming what should have been agricultural land into a graveyard that would haunt the nation for decades. Born in 1949, Pickton grew up on the very property that would later become synonymous with unspeakable evil. Raised alongside his siblings in a family that ran a legitimate pig farming operation in the suburban outskirts of Vancouver. The Pickton family property, located at 953 Dominion Avenue, consisted of several acres of land where pigs were raised and slaughtered, creating an environment where the presence of blood, bone, and death became normalized background features of daily life. As Robert grew into adulthood, he remained on the family property, developing a reputation among locals as an odd, unkempt man who lived in a trailer amid the filth and squalor of the farm, surrounded by rusting equipment, abandoned vehicles, and the constant presence of the pigs that would later play a horrific role in disposing of his victims. Throughout the 1990s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, a neighborhood known for poverty, drug addiction, and sex work, where vulnerable women lived on society's margins with little protection or attention from authorities. These disappearances occurred with alarming frequency, yet for years, law enforcement failed to recognize the pattern or treat these missing women as priority cases, a failure that would later be identified as systemic discrimination and neglect that allowed Pickton to continue killing for years. The missing women came from all walks of life before circumstances led them to the downtown East Side. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends who found themselves trapped in cycles of addiction and survival sex work, making them invisible to much of society and vulnerable to predators like Pickton. He frequented the downtown East Side, driving his distinctive vehicle through the streets and offering women money for sex, then taking them back to his isolated farm where they would never be seen again. The farm itself became a location for parties and gatherings, with Pickton and his brother Dave hosting events in a building on the property called the Piggy Palace Good Time Society. Ostensibly a charity organization, but in reality a cover for raucous parties where alcohol flowed freely and women from the downtown East Side were brought to entertain guests. During these gatherings and on other occasions, Pickton would lure women to various buildings on the sprawling property, including a slaughterhouse and his personal trailer, where he would attack, murder, and dismember his victims using the same tools and techniques employed in butchering pigs. The investigation into the missing women began slowly, hampered by police reluctance to dedicate resources to cases involving marginalized women, but eventually the sheer number of disappearances, which would ultimately exceed 60 women, forced authorities to take action. In 1997, the Vancouver Police Department finally created a special missing persons review team, though this came years after the disappearances began and after numerous families had been desperately reporting their loved ones missing without adequate police response. The breakthrough in the case came not from the missing persons investigation but from a separate incident in February 2002, when police executed a search warrant on the Pickton property while investigating illegal firearms possession. During this search, personal belongings of missing women began surfacing among the debris and filth of the property, including identification, clothing, and other items that the women would never have willingly left behind. As police expanded their search of the property, they made discoveries that defied comprehension, finding human remains mixed with animal remains in the farm's waste disposal areas, body parts in freezers, and DNA evidence scattered throughout multiple buildings on the property. The forensic investigation of the Pickton farm became one of the largest and most complex crime scene examinations in Canadian history, with investigators literally sifting through tons of soil, examining thousands of items, and working in conditions that traumatized even experienced homicide detectives. Anthropologists and forensic specialists worked for months on the property, often finding remains that had been processed through meat-rendering equipment, making identification extraordinarily difficult and leaving families without even complete remains to bury. Robert Pickton was arrested on February 22, 2002, initially on weapons charges, but as evidence mounted, he was charged with the murders of multiple women, with charges eventually encompassing 26 victims, though evidence suggested the true number of victims was much higher. During police interrogation, Pickton made damning statements to an undercover officer placed in his cell, complaining that he had wanted to kill 50 women to make it an even number, but had been caught before reaching his goal. His trial, which began in January 2007, became one of the longest and most expensive in Canadian history, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming physical evidence linking Pickton to the murders, including DNA evidence from victims found throughout the property. The jury heard testimony about how Pickton would handcuff, torture, and murder women in his trailer and slaughterhouse, then dismember their bodies and dispose of remains by feeding them to his pigs, mixing them with animal remains for rendering, or burying them in various locations around the farm. In December 2007, after a trial that lasted nearly a year, Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, and the remaining 20 charges were stayed, with prosecutors determining that pursuing additional trials would serve no practical purpose since Pickton was already facing the maximum possible sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence available under Canadian law, though many felt this was inadequate given the scope of his crimes. The Pickton case exposed catastrophic failures in how Canadian law enforcement treated missing persons cases involving marginalized women, leading to a public inquiry that examined systemic discrimination and resulted in recommendations for massive reforms in police practices. Families of the victims, many of whom had begged police for years to investigate their missing loved ones, testified at the inquiry about how their concerns were dismissed and how they were made to feel that their daughters and sisters didn't matter because of their lifestyle choices. The inquiry, led by Commissioner Wally Oppel, concluded that police bias and institutional indifference had allowed Pickton to kill for years, and that earlier action could have saved lives. Findings that brought some measure of validation to families even as they highlighted the preventable nature of this tragedy. The pig farm property was eventually expropriated by the provincial government and demolished, with soil removal operations ensuring that the land could never be used for agricultural purposes again, though the trauma inflicted on that land and in that community can never be fully erased. Robert Pickton remains incarcerated in maximum security, where he was seriously injured in a prison attack in 2007 when another inmate attempted to kill him, leaving him with severe head injuries that required hospitalization. The case continues to resonate in Canadian society as a stark reminder of how vulnerable populations can be victimized with impunity when systemic discrimination prevents proper police response, and how serial killers can operate openly when their victims are people society has deemed disposable. Many of the 60-plus women who disappeared from Vancouver's downtown Eastside during the years Pickton was active remain unaccounted for, their families living without closure, without remains to bury, without even certainty about what happened to their loved ones. The legacy of Robert Pickton extends beyond his individual crimes to encompass a broader indictment of social systems that failed to protect vulnerable women, police institutions that didn't value certain victims, and a society that allowed an entire neighborhood of marginalized people to exist in conditions where their lives were not adequately protected or valued. Number 2. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, the Ken and Barbie killers. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka presented to the world as an attractive, successful young couple living in the affluent Niagara region of Ontario, their blonde good looks and apparent normalcy earning them the media nickname the Ken and Barbie killers, a moniker that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the sadistic nature of their crimes. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, into a family whose surface respectability masked deep dysfunction, including his discovery as a teenager that the man he believed was his father was not his biological parent, and his mother's struggles with depression that left her bedridden for much of his childhood. Despite these challenges, Bernardo excelled academically and socially, becoming a confident, charming young man who attended the University of Toronto and worked in accounting, giving no outward sign of the violent predator lurking beneath his pleasant exterior. What neighbors and friends couldn't see was that beginning in May 1987, Bernardo had embarked on a campaign of sexual violence in Scarborough, attacking women in a series of rapes that would eventually number at least 14 victims and earn him the police designation, the Scarborough Rapist. Though his identity would remain unknown to investigators for years, his attacks followed a consistent pattern where he would wait near bus stops or other locations women passed through alone at night, suddenly grabbing victims from behind, threatening them with a knife, then forcing them to secluded areas where he would sexually assault them, often taking time to speak to his victims in a calm, conversational manner that made the experience even more psychologically disturbing. In October 1987, Bernardo met Karla Homolka at a restaurant in Scarborough, beginning a relationship that would evolve into one of the most disturbing partnerships in Canadian criminal history. Karla Leanne Homolka, born in 1970, was 17 years old at the time, a pretty, vivacious teenager from St. Catharines, Ontario, who worked at a veterinary clinic and seemed destined for a conventional middle-class life. The couple's relationship quickly intensified, with Bernardo discovering and encouraging Homolka's willingness to participate in increasingly deviant sexual activities, including his filming of their encounters and his expressed fantasies about raping and controlling young women. Homolka, rather than being repulsed by Bernardo's violent sexual interests, actively participated in fulfilling them, even going so far as to drug her own 15-year-old sister Tammy with animal tranquilizers stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked so that Bernardo could rape the unconscious teenager. On December 23, 1990, Karla and Paul carried out their plan to assault Tammy Homolka during a family gathering at the Homolka home, with Karla lacing her sister's drinks with halcyon and then holding a halothane-soaked cloth over Tammy's face while Bernardo raped her, videotaping the assault for later viewing. During this attack, Tammy began choking on her own vomit, and despite Karla's veterinary training and Paul's attempts at resuscitation, the 15-year-old died, forcing the couple to stage the scene to make the death appear accidental. Karla called 911 claiming her sister had choked after drinking too much at the family Christmas party, and the initial investigation accepted this explanation, ruling Tammy's death accidental and allowing Paul and Karla to escape responsibility despite having committed rape and manslaughter at minimum. The death of Tammy Homolka, rather than deterring the couple, seemed to escalate their depravity, as Bernardo now knew Homolka was willing to participate in the most extreme acts, including the death of her own sister, to maintain their relationship and fulfill his violent fantasies. In June 1991, just months after Tammy's death, the couple abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey from outside her home in Burlington, Ontario, after she found herself locked out late at night, with Bernardo approaching her with a knife and forcing her into his car while Homolka waited as his willing accomplice. They brought Leslie to the house they were renting at 57 Bayview Drive in Port Dalhousie, where they held her captive for 24 hours, repeatedly sexually assaulting her while videotaping the attacks, with Homolka actively participating in the abuse and even presenting herself to the terrified teenager as someone who could be trusted. On June 15, 1991, Bernardo strangled Leslie Mahaffey to death, and the couple then dismembered her body using a circular saw, encasing the body parts in cement blocks which they dumped in Lake Gibson, a small lake near St. Catharines. Leslie's remains were discovered on June 29, 1991, but the concrete encasement had made decomposition difficult to assess, and while police knew they were dealing with a homicide, they had few leads about the identity of the killers. In a display of staggering callousness, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka proceeded with their planned wedding on June 29, 1991, the very day Leslie Mahaffey's remains were discovered, holding a lavish ceremony at a historic church in Niagara-on-the-Lake and celebrating, while Leslie's family began their nightmare of grief and the community reeled from the discovery of the murdered teenager. Less than a year later, on April 16, 1992, the couple abducted 15-year-old Kristen French from a church parking lot in St. Catharines in broad daylight, with Homolka approaching the teenager with a map to ask for directions while Bernardo grabbed her from behind and forced her into their car. Kristen was held captive at the Bayview Drive house for 3 days, during which she was repeatedly tortured and sexually assaulted, with the couple again videotaping their crimes, creating horrific records of their victims' suffering that would later become crucial evidence. On April 19, 1992, Bernardo murdered Kristen French, and her body was discovered on April 30, 1992, dumped in a ditch in Burlington, having been posed in a manner that suggested the killer wanted the body to be found. The abduction of Kristen French in daylight from a public location created widespread panic in the Niagara region, with parents terrified to let their children out of sight and police under intense pressure to solve what were now clearly linked murders. The investigation, involving police from multiple jurisdictions and eventually including the FBI, struggled to develop suspects despite extensive witness interviews, forensic examinations, and public appeals. Meanwhile, the Bernardo-Homolka marriage was deteriorating, with Paul's violence no longer confined to strangers and captives but increasingly directed at Karla, who endured regular beatings that left her with visible injuries requiring medical attention. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction when DNA evidence from the Scarborough rapes, which had been sitting in a laboratory backlog for years, was finally processed in February 1993 and matched to Paul Bernardo, leading police to begin surveillance and investigation of him. On February 17, 1993, Karla Homolka left Paul Bernardo after a particularly severe beating, moving in with relatives and soon after contacting a lawyer, beginning negotiations for a deal that would see her testify against Bernardo in exchange for reduced charges. The deal Homolka secured, which would become one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in Canadian history, saw her plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in exchange for a 12-year sentence and full cooperation against Bernardo, an agreement reached before authorities knew about the videotapes showing her enthusiastic participation in the rapes, torture, and murders. Paul Bernardo was arrested on February 17, 1993, and charged initially with the Scarborough rapes, with murder charges following as the investigation progressed and Homolka provided detailed information about the crimes. The discovery of the videotapes, which Bernardo had hidden in a light fixture in the Bayview Drive house and which were not found until months after his arrest, revealed that Homolka had been far more than a reluctant participant coerced by an abusive husband, but rather an active, willing participant who took pleasure in the abuse of the victims. These revelations sparked public outrage about Homolka's lenient sentence, with many arguing that she deserved a murder conviction and life imprisonment rather than the 12 years she received. But the deal had already been signed and could not be revoked. Bernardo's trial in 1995 was a media sensation, with extensive coverage of the horrific details of the crimes, including descriptions of the videotaped evidence that was viewed by the jury but not shown to the public, sparing the victims' families from having their daughter's final torments broadcast to the world. The jury saw Homolka's testimony, where she portrayed herself as a battered wife acting under duress, though this narrative was contradicted by the videotape evidence showing her smiling, laughing, and actively participating in the assaults, even referring to the victims by degrading names and expressing no empathy or reluctance. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted of all charges including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple sexual assault charges, receiving a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years, later being designated a dangerous offender, ensuring he would likely never be released. Karla Homolka served her full 12-year sentence, being released from prison in July 2005 despite widespread public opposition and fears about her potential to reoffend, with her release subject to numerous conditions including restrictions on her movements and associations. After her release, Homolka violated the conditions of her release multiple times, including volunteering at a school without disclosing her criminal past, leading to public outcry and forcing her to relocate to avoid harassment. She eventually moved to the Caribbean and later Quebec, where she married and had children, living under her married name and attempting to maintain anonymity, though her identity has been exposed multiple times, leading to renewed public debate about whether someone who committed such heinous crimes can ever truly be rehabilitated or deserves the opportunity to live a normal life. The victims of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, are remembered not for the horrific manner of their deaths but for the vibrant, promising young women they were, taken from their families just as their lives were beginning, their potential forever unrealized because they encountered two predators who saw them not as human beings but as objects to be used and destroyed. The Mahaffey and French families have become advocates for victims' rights, speaking publicly about the ongoing trauma of losing their daughters and the additional pain caused by seeing Karla Homolka walk free after serving only 12 years, a sentence they view as a grotesque miscarriage of justice. The case exposed serious flaws in police coordination, as the Scarborough rape investigation and the Niagara murders investigation proceeded independently for years without recognizing they were dealing with the same offender, a failure that allowed Bernardo to continue killing when he might have been stopped sooner. The controversy over Homolka's deal has led to changes in how prosecutors approach plea agreements, with greater scrutiny of deals offered before all evidence is collected and greater reluctance to offer lenient sentences to participants in multiple murders regardless of their claimed subordinate role. Paul Bernardo remains in prison, where he has been repeatedly denied parole and is unlikely to ever be released given his dangerous offender designation and the nature of his crimes, spending his time in segregation away from the general prison population for his own safety. The house at 57 Bayview Drive, where Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French were tortured and murdered, was demolished by its owner after Bernardo's conviction. Unable to be sold or occupied given its horrific history, the land now vacant as a silent memorial to the evil that occurred there. The Bernardo Homolka case remains one of the most disturbing in Canadian history, not only because of the sadistic nature of the crimes, but because it revealed how evil can hide behind attractive, normal-seeming facades, and how two people together can descend into depravity that neither might have reached alone. Number 3. Clifford Olson, the Beast of British Columbia. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. earned his moniker as the Beast of British Columbia through a killing spree that terrorized the province in 1980 and 1981, murdering 11 children and young adults in crimes that shocked the nation and revealed the limitations of Canada's criminal justice system in dealing with predatory serial killers. Born on January 1, 1940, in Vancouver, Olson demonstrated antisocial tendencies and criminal behavior from childhood, accumulating his first conviction at age 17 and spending much of his adult life cycling in and out of prison for offenses ranging from fraud and theft to sexual assault and parole violations. By the time he began his murder spree, Olson had already established a lengthy criminal record with over 90 convictions, yet the parole system repeatedly released him back into society despite clear evidence that he posed a continuing danger to the public, a pattern that would have fatal consequences. In April 1981, Olson married Joan Hale, a woman who had corresponded with him while he was imprisoned and who apparently saw something redeemable in him despite his extensive criminal history, and this marriage would later play a crucial role in one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Shortly before and during his marriage, Olson had already begun killing, though authorities would not recognize the pattern until multiple victims had accumulated and precious time had been lost. His first confirmed victim was 12-year-old Christine Weller, who disappeared on November 17, 1980. While walking home in Surrey, British Columbia, her body discovered on Christmas Day 1980 in a remote area, showing signs of sexual assault and murder by blunt force trauma. The investigation into Christine's death proceeded slowly, with police having few leads and no reason, yet, to suspect they were dealing with a serial killer rather than an isolated tragic incident. On April 16, 1981, 13-year-old Colleen Degnaud disappeared from Surrey, and her body was discovered on April 21, 1981, but investigators still did not connect her murder to Christine Weller's death months earlier. The pace of Olson's killing accelerated dramatically through the summer of 1981, with victims disappearing in rapid succession as he cruised areas frequented by young people, offering rides, money, or promises of work to lure victims into his vehicle. 16-year-old Darren Johnsrud disappeared on April 22, 1981, followed by 16-year-old Sandra Wolfsteiner on May 19, 1981, 13-year-old Ada Court on June 21, 1981, 9-year-old Simon Partington on July 2, 1981, 14-year-old Judy Kozma on July 9, 1981, 15-year-old Raymond King on July 23, 1981, 18-year-old Sigrun around on July 25, 1981, 15-year-old Terry Lynn Carson on July 27, 1981, and finally 13-year-old Louise Chartrand on July 30, 1981. The disappearances created panic throughout British Columbia, particularly in the areas around Vancouver and the Fraser Valley where most of the victims were last seen, with parents terrified to let their children out of sight and communities organizing search parties and distributing flyers with pictures of the missing children. Police were overwhelmed by the number of cases and struggled to find connections between the victims, who varied in age from 9 to 18 and included both boys and girls, though most were female, making it difficult to establish a clear pattern or profile of who might be at risk. The breakthrough came when police investigating the disappearance of Judy Kozma discovered that Clifford Olson had been seen picking her up shortly before she vanished, leading investigators to begin surveillance of Olson and research into his background, discovering his extensive criminal history and history of sexual offenses. On August 12, 1981, Olson was arrested after police observed him attempting to abduct two female hitchhikers, though initially he was held only for the attempted abduction and violating his parole conditions while police worked to build evidence connecting him to the murders. During interrogation, Olson initially denied involvement in the disappearances and murders, but as evidence mounted and police pressure increased, he began hinting that he had information about the missing children, eventually proposing a deal that would become one of the most controversial transactions in Canadian criminal justice history. Olson offered to reveal the locations of his victims' bodies and provide full confessions in exchange for $100,000 to be paid to his wife Joan and their infant son, money that would supposedly provide for his family while he served what would inevitably be a life sentence. The offer created an ethical dilemma for law enforcement and prosecutors, who were desperate to bring closure to the victims' families by recovering the bodies and ensuring convictions, but were troubled by the idea of paying a serial killer for information about his own crimes. After extensive debate and consultation with the families of the victims, who overwhelmingly supported accepting the deal if it meant recovering their children's remains, the RCMP and the Attorney General of British Columbia agreed to the arrangement, known as the Cash for Bodies deal. Under the terms negotiated, Olson would receive $10,000 for each body he led police to, with the money placed in a trust for his wife and son, and in return he would provide detailed confessions and plead guilty to all charges, avoiding the need for trials that would force families to endure graphic testimony about their children's deaths. Between August and September 1981, Olson led police to the remains of his victims, scattered across remote locations throughout British Columbia, providing detailed descriptions of how he had lured, sexually assaulted, and murdered each child, showing no remorse and often providing gruesome, unnecessary details that seemed designed to further traumatize investigators and families. The recovery operations were heartbreaking, with search teams finding the bodies of children who had been missing for months, many decomposed beyond recognition and requiring identification through dental records or personal effects, bringing devastating confirmation to families who had been holding out hope their children might somehow still be alive. On January 14, 1982, Clifford Olson pleaded guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder in a British Columbia courtroom, formally admitting to the torture, sexual assault, and murder of Christine Weller, Colleen Digno, Darren Johnsrud, Sandra Wolfsteiner, Ada Court, Simon Partington, Judy Kozma, Raymond King, Sigrun Around, Terry Lynn Carson, and Louise Chartrand, receiving 11 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The Cash for Bodies deal sparked immediate public outrage, with many Canadians appalled that a serial killer had been paid $100,000 for information about his own crimes, arguing that it set a dangerous precedent and rewarded evil, though law enforcement and prosecutors defended the decision as necessary to bring closure to families and ensure convictions. The controversy led to legislative changes that prohibited similar payments in the future, though some questioned whether the real problem was not the payment itself, but the fact that Canada's parole system had repeatedly released a dangerous predator who should have remained incarcerated. Throughout his imprisonment, Olson proved to be a manipulative, attention-seeking psychopath who wrote letters to victims' families detailing their children's deaths, gave interviews to media claiming he had killed many more victims than the 11 for which he was convicted, and repeatedly sought parole despite having no realistic chance of release. In 1997, Olson was designated a dangerous offender under legislation that allowed indefinite detention of offenders deemed likely to reoffend violently, ensuring he would never be released regardless of the minimum parole eligibility date on his sentence. He appeared before parole boards multiple times over the years, always being denied, often using these appearances as opportunities to torment victims' families who would show up to oppose his release, listening as he described their children's deaths or made unfounded claims about additional victims. In one particularly cruel incident, Olson sent a letter to the family of one of his victims on the anniversary of the murder, describing in detail the child's final moments, an act of pure sadism that resulted in additional restrictions on his correspondence and communication. Clifford Olson died of cancer on September 30, 2011, while incarcerated at a Quebec hospital, never having shown genuine remorse for his crimes and having spent his final years attempting to profit from his infamy by trying to sell letters and memorabilia to crime collectors. His death was met with relief by victims' families, who had endured decades of his attempts to torment them and who could finally be assured he would never again contact them or appear before a parole board claiming to be rehabilitated. The question of whether the cash for bodies deal was justified remains debated in Canadian legal circles, with some arguing it was a necessary pragmatic decision that brought closure to families and others maintaining it was a moral failure that compromised justice by compensating a killer. The families of Olson's victims have largely supported the deal, acknowledging that while it was distasteful to provide money to Olson's family, the ability to recover their children's remains and provide proper burials was worth the moral compromise, giving them a measure of closure they would not otherwise have had. The case exposed significant failures in British Columbia's parole system, which had released Olson repeatedly despite his extensive criminal record and clear danger to society, leading to reforms in how parole decisions were made and greater emphasis on public safety over rehabilitation prospects. The Clifford Olson case established British Columbia's reputation as a hunting ground for serial killers, a perception that would be reinforced by subsequent cases and that spoke to vulnerabilities in how the province's vast geography and independent youth culture created opportunities for predators. The 11 children and young adults murdered by Olson are remembered not as statistics or victims, but as individuals whose lives were cut short just as they were beginning. Their families forever marked by grief but determined to honor their memories by advocating for victims' rights and improved child safety measures. The Olson case remains a watershed moment in Canadian criminal justice, highlighting the challenges of protecting society from predatory serial killers, the ethical dilemmas that arise in investigating such crimes, and the lifelong trauma inflicted not only on victims but on their families, investigating officers, and entire communities. Number 4. Russell Williams, the colonel and commander who became a killer. Colonel David Russell Williams held one of the most prestigious positions in the Canadian military, serving as commander of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the country's largest Air Force base, a role that made him responsible for transporting dignitaries including the Queen and the Prime Minister. Yet behind this facade of honor and responsibility lurked a disturbed individual whose crimes would shock the nation and devastate the military's reputation. Born on March 7, 1963, in Bromsgrove, England, Williams moved to Canada with his family as a child and grew up in comfortable middle-class circumstances, excelling academically and eventually attending the University of Toronto, where he studied economics and political science before joining the Canadian Armed Forces in 1987. His military career was exemplary, with steady advancement through the ranks, specialized training as a pilot, and postings to various bases across Canada and internationally, building a reputation as a professional, competent officer who could be trusted with increasingly important responsibilities. In 1991, Williams married Mary Elizabeth Harriman, a successful executive with a major charity organization, and the couple appeared to live an ideal life in suburban Ottawa, with no children but successful careers, financial security, and respect in their community. What neither his wife nor his colleagues knew was that Williams harbored deviant sexual compulsions that had begun manifesting through break-ins to homes where he would steal women's underwear, a behavior that escalated over years from simple theft to increasingly bold and dangerous crimes. The break-ins began in 2007 when Williams was posted to Shearwater, Nova Scotia, breaking into homes in the area and stealing lingerie, often photographing himself wearing the stolen items in elaborate sessions where he would document his activities with hundreds of digital images. After being promoted to commander of CFB Trenton in July 2009, Williams continued his break-ins in the communities surrounding the base, including the town of Tweed, where he and his wife owned a cottage on Cozy Cove Lane, and where his crimes would escalate from theft to sexual assault and ultimately to murder. On September 17, 2009, Williams broke into a home in Tweed and sexually assaulted a woman while she slept, photographing the assault before fleeing, marking a dramatic escalation in his criminal behavior from property crimes to violent sexual offenses. The victim reported the assault to police, but with no suspects and limited evidence, the investigation struggled to gain traction, and Williams remained free to continue his activities. On September 30, 2009, Williams broke into another home in Tweed and committed a second sexual assault, again photographing his crime and fleeing before the victim could identify him, demonstrating an increasing boldness and willingness to take risks that suggested his compulsions were spiraling beyond his control. The two sexual assaults created fear in the small community of Tweed, where residents were unaccustomed to such crimes and where the violation of homes, traditionally places of safety, left people feeling vulnerable and afraid. On November 24, 2009, Williams committed his first murder, breaking into the home of Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 38-year-old military flight attendant who served under his command at CFB Trenton, attacking her when she returned home from work, binding her, sexually assaulting her, and ultimately strangling her to death while photographing and videotaping the entire ordeal. Comeau's body was discovered the following day when she failed to report for duty, and the investigation initially focused on her personal life and possible romantic connections, with investigators not immediately recognizing the connection to the earlier break-ins and sexual assaults in the area. On January 28, 2010, Williams abducted Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman who lived alone in Belleville, Ontario, breaking into her home at night, subduing her, and transporting her to his cottage in Tweed where he held her captive, sexually assaulting her repeatedly over several hours while taking photographs and videos, before strangling her to death. Williams then transported Lloyd's body in his vehicle and dumped it in a field near Tweed, covering it with debris in an attempt to conceal it, though he made no effort to bury the remains or transport them far from the area. Jessica Lloyd's disappearance triggered a massive search operation involving hundreds of volunteers and multiple police agencies, with her family making public appeals for information and the community rallying to help find the missing woman. The investigation received a crucial break when police examining the area around Lloyd's home discovered tire tracks that appeared fresh and out of place, leading them to canvass the area for vehicles matching the tread pattern, a painstaking process that involved checking thousands of vehicles. On February 4, 2010, Ontario Provincial Police investigators interviewed Russell Williams at his CFB Trenton office because his vehicle matched the tire tread pattern found near Jessica Lloyd's home. And during this initial interview, Williams provided answers that seemed cooperative but raised subtle red flags for the experienced detective conducting the interview. Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the OPP's Behavioral Sciences Unit, one of Canada's most skilled interrogators, conducted a follow-up interview with Williams on February 7, 2010, at OPP headquarters in Smiths Falls, an interrogation that would become famous in law enforcement circles for the psychological techniques employed and the devastating effectiveness with which Smith extracted a full confession. The interrogation lasted approximately 10 hours, during which Smith gradually and methodically dismantled Williams's denials, presenting evidence of his vehicle's presence near Jessica Lloyd's home, pointing out inconsistencies in his statements, and appealing to Williams's sense of duty and concern for Jessica Lloyd's family, who deserved to know what had happened to her. Williams initially maintained his innocence, claiming he had simply been in the area on legitimate business. But as Smith presented more evidence and created psychological pressure by emphasizing the inevitability of the truth coming out, Williams's resistance crumbled. Approximately 3 hours into the interrogation, Williams confessed to killing Jessica Lloyd, and over the following hours, he provided detailed confessions to the murder of Marie-France Comeau, the 2 sexual assaults in Tweed, and dozens of break-ins where he had stolen underwear and other items, creating a comprehensive account of years of criminal activity. Williams also revealed the existence of thousands of photographs and videos documenting his crimes, stored on hard drives at his Ottawa home, providing a horrifyingly detailed record of his deviant behavior and the escalation of his crimes over time. The confession led to the immediate recovery of Jessica Lloyd's body from the location Williams described, bringing devastating confirmation to her family but also providing them with the ability to properly lay her to rest. Police searches of Williams's homes and his office at CFB Trenton recovered the extensive digital evidence he had described, including photographs of him wearing stolen underwear, images and videos of the sexual assaults and murders, and detailed records of his break-ins, creating an overwhelming evidentiary record that left no possibility of contesting his guilt. The military and the Canadian government were thrown into crisis by the revelation that one of their most senior officers and the commander of their largest airbase was a serial rapist and murderer, raising questions about how someone with such severe psychological disturbances could rise to such a position of responsibility and trust. Russell Williams was immediately stripped of his rank and dismissed from the Canadian Armed Forces in disgrace, with the military taking the unprecedented step of burning his uniforms and destroying all photos of him in uniform to symbolically erase his presence from military history. On October 21, 2010, Williams pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 82 counts of break and enter, receiving 2 life sentences to be served concurrently with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available under Canadian law. The guilty plea spared the victims' families and the sexual assault survivors from the trauma of a trial, though victim impact statements read in court provided heartbreaking testimony about the ongoing suffering caused by Williams's crimes. Mary Elizabeth Harriman, Williams's wife, filed for divorce and has maintained complete silence about the case, never speaking publicly about her husband's crimes or whether she had any awareness of his activities, though investigations found no evidence she knew about his criminal behavior. The Comeau and Lloyd families delivered powerful victim impact statements describing the devastating loss of their loved ones and the trauma of knowing the horrific circumstances of their deaths, with Jessica Lloyd's brother Andy Lloyd becoming a vocal advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. The case raised troubling questions about whether Williams's position of authority and his military training had enabled his crimes or provided him with skills that made him more effective and dangerous as a predator, though ultimately these questions proved unanswerable. The interrogation video of Williams's confession became a training tool for law enforcement agencies worldwide, studied as an example of effective interrogation technique and psychological pressure applied ethically within legal boundaries to extract a confession from a highly intelligent, controlled suspect. Russell Williams remains incarcerated in maximum security, serving his life sentence with the knowledge that he will likely die in prison, having destroyed his own life along with the lives of his victims and their families, and having permanently damaged the reputation of the Canadian military institution he once represented. The base commander's residence at CFB Trenton, where Williams lived, was demolished, unable to serve its function after being occupied by a murderer, a physical erasure that paralleled the military's attempts to erase Williams from their history. The communities of Belleville and Tweed, where Williams committed many of his crimes, were left traumatized and struggling to reconcile the monster who had lived among them with their previous sense of safety and community trust. The Williams case demonstrated that serial predators can hide behind even the most respectable facades, holding positions of great trust and responsibility while concealing compulsions and criminal behaviors that exist in complete contradiction to their public personas. The extensive photographic and video record Williams created of his crimes provided crucial evidence for prosecution but also represented a disturbing aspect of his psychology, suggesting he needed to document and revisit his crimes, creating permanent records of others' suffering for his own gratification. The fact that Williams targeted a subordinate in the murder of Marie-France Comeau added an additional dimension of betrayal, as she had served under his command and had every reason to believe he was a trustworthy superior officer, not a predatory killer who would target her because of her vulnerability as a woman living alone. The Russell Williams case remains one of Canada's most shocking criminal cases, not because of the number of victims, which was relatively limited compared to other serial killers, but because of the extreme contradiction between the offender's public position and his private crimes, demonstrating that evil can lurk behind the most trusted and respected positions in society. Number 5. Bruce McArthur, the landscaper serial killer. Bruce McArthur lived for decades as an unremarkable figure in Toronto's urban landscape, working as a self-employed landscaper and mall Santa Claus, maintaining a benign public image while concealing a murderous compulsion that targeted vulnerable men in the city's gay village and led to at least 8 deaths before his arrest in January 2018. Born on October 8, 1951, in Lindsay, Ontario, McArthur grew up in rural Ontario, married a woman named Janice Campbell in 1975, and had 2 children, living what appeared to be a conventional middle-class life working in sales and other occupations. In the late 1990s, McArthur and his wife separated, and he came out as gay, beginning to frequent Toronto's Church Wellesley Village, the city's historic LGBTQ neighborhood, where he established connections within the community and began exploring an identity he had suppressed for decades. In 2003, McArthur was convicted of assault with a weapon and assault for attacking a man with a metal pipe during a sexual encounter that turned violent, receiving a conditional sentence that allowed him to serve his time in the community rather than in prison, a lenient outcome that would later be criticized as insufficient given the violent nature of the attack. This conviction should have raised red flags about McArthur's potential for violence, yet he was able to continue his landscaping business and maintain his position within the community, with many people apparently unaware of his criminal record. Beginning in 2010 and continuing through 2017, men began disappearing from Toronto's gay village, many of them immigrants from South Asia or the Middle East who were part of the LGBTQ community but maintained varying degrees of closeness with their families and cultural communities, making their disappearances particularly complex for investigators. The first victim now known to have been killed by McArthur was Skandaraj Navaratnam, who disappeared in September 2010, a 40-year-old man originally from Sri Lanka who had fled civil war and established a life in Toronto, working in bars in the gay village and building a network of friends who noticed when he vanished. In 2012, Abdulbasir Faizi, a 42-year-old Afghan immigrant who was married with children but secretly gay, disappeared, and his family reported him missing, though the investigation struggled because Faizi had been living a double life and his family was unaware of his activities in the gay village. Majid Kayhan disappeared in 2012 as well, another Afghan immigrant who had refugee status in Canada and who, like Faizi, was navigating the complexities of being LGBTQ while maintaining ties to a community and culture where homosexuality was not accepted. In 2015 and 2016, Sarush Mahmoodi and Dean Lisowick disappeared, both men who were more marginalized, with Lisowick being homeless at the time of his disappearance, making him less likely to be reported missing quickly or to receive sustained attention from law enforcement. Salim Eason disappeared in April 2017, and Andrew Kinsman in June 2017, and it was Kinsman's disappearance that finally catalyzed a serious police investigation because he was well connected in the community, had a large circle of friends who immediately noticed his absence, and had been keeping detailed records of his activities and communications that provided investigators with leads. Friends of Andrew Kinsman reported him missing within days of his disappearance, and because he had been active in LGBTQ advocacy and had many people who cared about his well-being, his case received attention that previous disappearances had not, though police were slow to connect his disappearance to the earlier missing persons cases. The investigation began to focus on patterns among the missing men, who were predominantly of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, were part of the LGBTQ community and had disappeared from the same general area of Toronto, suggesting a predator who was specifically targeting vulnerable men from these communities. Surveillance camera footage from near Andrew Kinsman's apartment building showed him getting into a red Dodge Caravan on the day he disappeared, and police worked to identify the vehicle, eventually tracing it to Bruce McArthur through painstaking review of traffic cameras and vehicle registration records. As police investigated McArthur, they discovered his 2003 assault conviction and began surveillance, watching him continue his landscaping work while they built their case, not yet having enough evidence to arrest him but increasingly convinced he was connected to the disappearances. On January 18, 2018, police arrested Bruce McArthur at his apartment on Thorncliffe Park Drive after obtaining evidence that he was planning to kill another victim, saving that person's life by intervening before McArthur could carry out the attack. The arrest triggered a massive investigation as police sought to determine the extent of McArthur's crimes and to locate the remains of his victims, a search that would eventually focus on the numerous properties where McArthur had worked as a landscaper and where he had access to plant and hide bodies. Investigators began excavating properties across Toronto where McArthur had done landscaping work, focusing particularly on a property on Mallory Crescent in the Eastside neighborhood where McArthur had worked for years and where the elderly homeowners had given him virtually unrestricted access to the gardens. On January 29, 2018, police announced they had recovered human remains from planters at the Mallory Crescent property, beginning a grim process of excavating and sifting through soil in multiple locations to recover the dismembered remains of McArthur's victims. The investigation revealed that McArthur had murdered his victims, dismembered their bodies, and buried the remains in the gardens of properties where he worked, using his landscaping business as a cover for body disposal and returning to these sites regularly to maintain the gardens, literally tending the graves of his victims as part of his job. Police also discovered that McArthur had kept personal items belonging to his victims, including jewelry and other effects, storing them as trophies and photographing them in disturbing staged scenes, demonstrating the psychology of a serial killer who wanted to maintain connections to his crimes. The recovery operations at various properties across Toronto continued for months, with forensic anthropologists working to identify remains and determine how many victims there were, eventually confirming 8 murders and identifying the victims as Skandaraj Navratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majid Kayhan, Sarush Mahmoodi, Dean Lisowick, Salim Izan, Andrew Kinsman, and Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, the last having disappeared in 2015. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating in Toronto's gay village for nearly 8 years, killing at least 8 men while police failed to recognize the pattern or connect the disappearances, sparked criticism of law enforcement and raised serious questions about whether police had taken the disappearances seriously because the victims were gay men, many of them immigrants or people of color. The Toronto Police Service faced intense scrutiny over their handling of the missing persons investigations, with advocates pointing out that disappearances of marginalized men from the LGBTQ community had not received the same level of attention or resources that would have been devoted to disappearances of straight white individuals. In April 2018, Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders apologized to the LGBTQ community for the service's failures in the investigation, acknowledging that police should have connected the cases sooner and that systemic bias may have played a role in the delayed response. On January 29, 2019, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder in a Toronto courtroom, formally admitting to the murders of all 8 identified victims and receiving 8 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, sparing victims' families from the trauma of detailed testimony about their loved ones' deaths. Though victim impact statements provided heart-wrenching accounts of the grief and loss experienced by those left behind, the families of McArthur's victims spoke at the sentencing hearing about the devastating impact of losing their loved ones, with many expressing anger that it had taken so long for police to recognize that a serial killer was operating and frustration that their initial missing persons reports had not been taken seriously. The LGBTQ community in Toronto and across Canada expressed relief at MacArthur's arrest and conviction, but also anger at the systemic failures that had allowed him to kill for so long. Viewing the case as evidence of ongoing discrimination and lack of protection for vulnerable LGBTQ individuals, particularly those who were also immigrants or people of color. The case prompted an independent review of how Toronto police handle missing persons investigations, with particular focus on whether bias affects how seriously different cases are treated and what changes are needed to ensure all missing persons receive equal attention regardless of their background or lifestyle. Bruce MacArthur remains incarcerated serving his life sentences. Now in his 70s and unlikely to ever be released given his age and the severity of his crimes, spending his remaining years with the knowledge of the lives he destroyed. The properties where MacArthur buried his victims have become sites of difficult memory for the families and the community, with some families finding it traumatic to know their loved ones' remains were literally beneath gardens that MacArthur tended as part of his normal work. The case demonstrated how serial killers can operate for years within communities when their victims are marginalized individuals whose disappearances are not treated with urgency, and how the failure to recognize patterns in missing persons cases can allow predators to continue killing when earlier intervention might have saved lives. The families of MacArthur's victims have had to endure not only the loss of their loved ones but also the knowledge that many of these men were living double lives due to cultural and social pressures around homosexuality, meaning their families didn't have complete knowledge of their activities and relationships, adding complexity to their grief. The Bruce MacArthur case stands as a stark reminder of the continuing vulnerability of LGBTQ individuals, particularly those from immigrant communities who may face additional pressures and marginalization, and the need for law enforcement to recognize and respond to crimes targeting these communities with the same urgency and resources devoted to protecting more privileged populations. Number 6. Peter Woodcock, Canada's youngest serial killer. Peter Woodcock became Canada's youngest serial killer when, at age 17, he murdered 3 children in Toronto in 1956 and 1957, crimes that shocked the nation and raised troubling questions about juvenile justice, mental illness, and the possibility of rehabilitation for violent young offenders. Born David Michael Kruger on March 5, 1939, in Toronto, the child who would become Peter Woodcock entered life in circumstances that virtually guaranteed a troubled future. Born to a 17-year-old unmarried mother who gave him up for adoption but then repeatedly disrupted adoption placements by reclaiming him, creating a pattern of abandonment and instability that would mark his entire childhood. Between birth and age 3, Woodcock was shuffled between his birth mother and 3 different foster homes, never establishing stable attachments and experiencing rejection and abandonment repeatedly at the most crucial developmental stage when children form basic trust and attachment. At age 3, he was finally adopted by the Maston family, who renamed him Peter Woodcock, but the damage from his early years had already been done, and he exhibited disturbed behavior from childhood, including cruelty to animals, fire setting, and violent fantasies that should have raised serious red flags. Despite these warning signs, the mental health resources and understanding of childhood psychological disturbance in the 1940s and 1950s were limited, and Woodcock did not receive the intensive intervention he needed, instead growing into adolescence with his violent compulsions intensifying and his ability to control them diminishing. By his teenage years, Woodcock had developed an obsession with young children, spending time in parks and playgrounds watching children and fantasizing about harming them, a dangerous pattern that went undetected by parents, teachers, or authorities who might have intervened. On September 15, 1956, Woodcock encountered 7-year-old Wayne Millett playing in a Toronto park, luring the boy away from the playground with promises of showing him something interesting, then taking him to a secluded area where he sexually assaulted and strangled him, hiding the body in undergrowth before calmly returning to his daily activities. Wayne Millett's body was discovered the following day, and the investigation revealed he had been sexually assaulted and murdered, creating shock in the community and fear among parents, though police had few leads and no suspects. On October 6, 1956, Less than a month after killing Wayne Millett, Woodcock attacked 9-year-old Gary Morris in another Toronto park, again luring the child away from public areas with conversation and false promises before sexually assaulting and beating him to death with a rock, demonstrating an escalation in violence and a shortened cooling-off period between kills. The murder of Gary Morris intensified public fear and police pressure to solve the crimes, with investigators recognizing they were likely dealing with the same killer but struggling to develop suspects in an era before DNA testing, extensive surveillance cameras, or computerized criminal databases. On January 19, 1957, Woodcock committed his third murder, attacking 4-year-old Carol Voice in yet another park, strangling her after a sexual assault and leaving her body to be discovered by horrified park users. The 3 murders within 4 months created widespread panic in Toronto, with parents afraid to let children play outside and communities organizing watch groups to patrol parks and playgrounds. Though these efforts could not change the fact that a child predator was operating freely and police were no closer to identifying him. The break in the case came not through traditional detective work but through Woodcock's own deteriorating mental state, as he began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior that brought him to the attention of mental health professionals, eventually leading to his admission to a psychiatric facility. While under psychiatric evaluation, Woodcock confessed to the 3 murders, providing details that only the killer could know and shocking his evaluators with the casual manner in which he described torturing and killing young children. Because Woodcock was only 17 years old at the time of the murders, he could not be tried as an adult under the laws existing in 1957, presenting a legal challenge about how to handle a juvenile who had committed crimes that would warrant life imprisonment if committed by an adult. After psychiatric evaluation concluded that Woodcock was suffering from severe mental illness and posed a continuing danger to society, he was found not criminally responsible by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to a maximum security psychiatric facility rather than being sentenced to prison. The decision to institutionalize Woodcock rather than imprison him reflected the prevailing theories of the time that mental illness could be treated, and that even violent offenders might be rehabilitated through psychiatric intervention, assumptions that would be tested over the following decades. Woodcock spent the next 35 years in the Oak Ridge division of the Penetanguishene Mental Health Center, a maximum security psychiatric facility in Ontario where he received treatment and was evaluated regularly for potential release. During his institutionalization, Woodcock participated in various therapeutic programs, including controversial experimental treatments in the 1960s and 1970s that aimed to rehabilitate violent offenders through intensive group therapy and other interventions, programs that were later criticized as ineffective and potentially harmful. As the decades passed and Woodcock reached middle age, psychiatrists evaluating him reported that he had made progress, that he expressed remorse for his crimes, and that he appeared to have gained insight into his mental illness and the factors that had led to his violent behavior. Based on these evaluations and a belief that Woodcock had been successfully rehabilitated after 35 years of treatment, authorities granted him supervised passes to leave the facility for brief periods, allowing him to experience limited freedom while still under psychiatric supervision. On July 3, 1991, while on one of these supervised passes, Woodcock, then 52 years old, attacked and murdered Dennis Kerr, a fellow psychiatric patient who had been designated to accompany him on the outing, brutally beating Kerr with a hatchet in a wooded area, demonstrating that despite decades of treatment, his violent compulsions remained active and deadly. The murder of Dennis Kerr shocked the psychiatric community and the public, raising serious questions about the decision to grant passes to someone who had murdered 3 children and about the very possibility of rehabilitating certain types of violent offenders. Woodcock was charged with first-degree murder in Kerr's death, tried as an adult, and convicted, receiving a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years, ensuring he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. The Kerr murder effectively ended any debate about whether Woodcock could be safely released and demonstrated that his earlier expressions of remorse and apparent rehabilitation had been either insincere or insufficient to control his violent impulses when given the opportunity to offend. The case became a cautionary tale cited by opponents of rehabilitation programs for violent offenders, used as evidence that some individuals, particularly those who commit extreme violence at young ages, may never be safe to release regardless of how much time passes or how much treatment they receive. Woodcock's case also raised difficult questions about the juvenile justice system and how society should handle children and adolescents who commit heinous crimes, balancing the developmental differences between juveniles and adults against the severity of their actions and the risk they pose to public safety. Peter Woodcock died in prison in March 2010 at age 71, having spent virtually his entire life since age 17 either in psychiatric institutions or prison, his life consumed by the consequences of the murders he committed as a teenager. The families of Wayne Millett, Gary Morris, and Carol Voice lived with the trauma of their losses for decades, with some family members dying before Woodcock himself, never seeing the justice they felt was denied when he was initially sent to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. The case of Dennis Kerr added another layer of tragedy, as his death resulted directly from the decision to grant privileges to Woodcock, making Kerr's family victims of both Woodcock's violence and the systemic failures that allowed him the freedom to kill again. The Woodcock case remains relevant in contemporary debates about juvenile justice, as policymakers and courts grapple with how to handle young offenders who commit serious violent crimes, weighing the developmental science showing that adolescent brains are not fully formed against the reality that some juvenile offenders commit crimes as heinous as any adult and pose comparable risks. The fact that Woodcock's violence emerged from severe early childhood trauma and abandonment raised questions about prevention and early intervention, highlighting how childhood maltreatment and disrupted attachments can create violent individuals and suggesting that earlier, more effective intervention might have prevented his crimes. The experimental psychiatric programs in which Woodcock participated during his institutionalization, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, have since been discredited and criticized for their methods and lack of effectiveness, adding another dimension to the tragedy of how his case was handled. Peter Woodcock's crimes, committed when he was barely beyond childhood himself, created ripples of trauma that extended across decades and multiple generations, affecting not only his direct victims and their families but also the broader community's sense of safety and trust, demonstrating how a single individual's violence can impact far more people than those they directly harm. Number 7. Alan Legere, the monster of the Miramichi. Alan Joseph Legere earned his designation as the Monster of the Miramichi through a reign of terror that gripped New Brunswick in 1989, escaping from custody while serving a life sentence for murder and embarking on a killing spree that traumatized a region and exposed serious flaws in correctional security. Born on February 13, 1948, in Chatham Head, New Brunswick, Legere grew up in the Miramichi region, an area of tight-knit communities along the Miramichi River where everyone knew their neighbors and violent crime was rare, making the terror he would later inflict particularly shocking to the local population. Legere's criminal career began with property crimes and escalated over the years to increasingly violent offenses, demonstrating a pattern of escalation that should have identified him as a serious threat to public safety. On June 21, 1986, Legere and two accomplices broke into the home of 66-year-old shopkeeper John Glendenning in Black River Bridge, New Brunswick, planning to rob him, but the crime escalated to brutal violence when they beat Glendenning to death with a television set and then set his house on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. Legere was arrested for Glendenning's murder along with his accomplices, and in November 1987, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 18 years, a sentence that should have kept him incarcerated and unable to harm anyone for nearly 2 decades. However, on May 3, 1989, while being transported from the Atlantic Institution Maximum Security Penitentiary to a hospital in Moncton for treatment of an ear infection, Legere escaped from his guards, overpowering them despite being handcuffed and fleeing into the Moncton area, beginning a 7-month period of freedom during which he would commit a series of horrific crimes. The escape itself exposed serious security failures in the correctional system, as Legere should have been under maximum security protocols given his violent history and life sentence. Yet the transport arrangements allowed him an opportunity to escape that he successfully exploited. During his months on the run, Leger survived by breaking into homes, stealing food, money, and vehicles, and attacking anyone who had the misfortune to encounter him, moving through rural New Brunswick and repeatedly returning to the Miramichi region where he had grown up and where he knew the geography and could find places to hide. On May 29, 1989, just weeks after his escape, Leger broke into the home of 75-year-old Annie Flam and 64-year-old Nina Flam, two sisters who lived together in Newcastle, beating them both savagely, sexually assaulting them, and setting their house on fire, with Annie dying from her injuries and Nina barely surviving the attack. The brutality of the attack on the Flam sisters shocked the region, and when investigators determined that evidence linked the crime to Alan Leger, panic spread as residents realized that the escaped murderer was not just hiding but actively attacking people, specifically targeting elderly women living in isolated homes. On October 13, 1989, Leger broke into the home of 45-year-old Linda Donnie in Newcastle, beating her to death with a blunt object and sexually assaulting her, demonstrating that his violence was not limited to elderly victims but extended to any vulnerable woman he encountered. 2 days later, on October 15, 1989, Leger murdered 69-year-old Reverend James Smith and his 66-year-old wife Donna Smith in their home in Chatham Head, beating the elderly couple to death in an attack of shocking brutality that seemed to serve no purpose beyond violence itself, as little was stolen from the home. The murder of the Smiths, a beloved minister and his wife who were pillars of their community, brought the terror in the Miramichi region to a peak, with residents arming themselves, refusing to stay alone, and demanding that authorities do more to capture Leger. The manhunt for Leger became one of the largest in Canadian history, with hundreds of police officers from multiple agencies searching the region, setting up roadblocks, conducting door-to-door searches, and following up on hundreds of tips from terrified residents who reported suspicious sightings or activity. The psychological impact on the Miramichi region during Leger's months of freedom was profound, with residents living in constant fear, changing their routines, installing extra locks and security systems, and suffering from anxiety and hypervigilance that wouldn't fully abate even after his eventual capture. Forensic evidence from the crime scenes, including fingerprints and DNA, definitively linked Leger to the murders, giving police certainty about the perpetrator's identity but not helping them locate him as he moved through the region, sometimes hiding in wooded areas, sometimes breaking into homes where residents were away, always staying one step ahead of the search efforts. On November 24, 1989, police finally arrested Alan Leger following a tip that led them to a location in Rogersville, New Brunswick, where they surrounded him and took him into custody without resistance, ending 7 months of terror that had left 4 people dead and an entire region traumatized. The relief following Leger's capture was immense, with residents finally able to return to normal routines and sleep without fear, though the psychological scars from the months of terror would persist for years. Leger's trial for the murders committed during his escape began in 1991, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming forensic evidence linking him to each crime scene, including DNA evidence that was among the first uses of DNA profiling in a Canadian criminal case. The trial revealed the horrific details of Leger's crimes, including the brutality with which he had beaten his elderly victims, the sexual assaults he had committed, and the calculated nature of his actions as he targeted vulnerable people in isolated locations. On November 3, 1991, Alan Leger was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of Annie Flam, Linda Donnie, and James and Donna Smith, as well as multiple counts of sexual assault, arson, and break and enter, receiving 4 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The conviction brought a measure of justice and closure to the families of the victims and to the Miramichi community, though it could never undo the trauma or bring back the lives lost. Leger's escape and subsequent crimes led to a major review of correctional security protocols, with recommendations for changes in how dangerous offenders are transported and monitored, though critics argued these changes came too late to prevent the deaths that occurred during his freedom. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of rural communities where homes are isolated and emergency response times are longer, making residents particularly susceptible to predators who know how to exploit these geographic realities. Alan Legere was designated a dangerous offender, ensuring that even if he becomes eligible for parole consideration, he can be held indefinitely if authorities determine he remains a threat to public safety. He has been denied parole at every hearing since becoming eligible, with parole boards consistently concluding that he continues to pose a risk and shows no genuine remorse or rehabilitation. Legere remains incarcerated in maximum security, now in his 70s, having spent over 3 decades in prison since his 1989 capture, and likely to remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. The families of his victims, including the survivors of the Flam attack, have had to live with the trauma of what he did, with some family members speaking publicly about the ongoing impact of losing their loved ones to such senseless violence. The Miramichi region has gradually healed from the terror of 1989, though residents old enough to remember those months still speak of them with a shudder, and the case remains a defining moment in the region's history. The designation Monster of the Miramichi reflects not just the nature of Legere's crimes, but the particular terror he inflicted on a specific community, transforming a peaceful region into a place of fear and demonstrating how a single individual can traumatize an entire population. The Alan Legere case serves as a reminder of the importance of correctional security and the catastrophic consequences when dangerous offenders are able to escape, as well as the particular vulnerability of elderly people and women living alone to predatory violence. The successful use of DNA evidence to convict Legere marked an important milestone in Canadian forensic science, helping to establish the reliability and admissibility of such evidence in criminal trials and paving the way for its use in countless cases since. Number 8. Cody Leachbokoff, Canada's youngest serial killer of the modern era. Cody Allen Leachbokoff earned the grim distinction of being Canada's youngest modern-era serial killer when he murdered 4 women between 2009 and 2010 in the area around Prince George, British Columbia, committing his first murder at age 19 and demonstrating a level of violence and depravity shocking in someone barely beyond adolescence. Born on January 21, 1990, in Fort St. James, British Columbia, Leachbokoff grew up in what appeared to be a normal family environment in the small northern community, participating in sports, attending school, and giving no obvious outward signs of the violent predator he would become. By his late teens, Leachbokoff had moved to Prince George, a city in central British Columbia that has long struggled with high rates of crime and violence, particularly against Indigenous women, creating an environment where vulnerable women faced significant risks and where murders often went unsolved. His first known victim was 15-year-old Lorraine Dawn Leslie, a young woman from Fraser Lake who was in foster care and struggling with the challenges many youth in care face, including instability, lack of support systems, and vulnerability to exploitation. On November 27, 2010, Leachbokoff encountered Leslie and lured her to a remote area outside Prince George, where he brutally attacked her, beating her to death with a pipe wrench and attempting to conceal her body in a wooded area, demonstrating a level of violence that was shockingly disproportionate to any possible provocation. The murder of Lorraine Leslie would remain unsolved for years, as investigators struggled to develop leads and the case became one of many unsolved homicides of young women in the region. What police did not know at the time was that Lorraine Leslie was not Leachbokoff's first victim but rather his fourth, as he had already killed 3 women but their bodies had not yet been discovered and the murders had not been connected. On September 10, 2009, Leachbokoff had murdered Jill Stacy Stuchenko, a 35-year-old mother who struggled with addiction and worked in survival sex work, making her vulnerable to predators and less likely to be immediately reported missing or to receive intensive police attention. On October 9, 2009, he killed Cynthia Frances Moss, a 35-year-old woman who, like Stuchenko, was involved in the street-level drug and sex work scene in Prince George, again targeting someone whose vulnerability and marginalization made her an easier victim and whose disappearance was less likely to trigger immediate investigation. On April 13, 2010, Lichbokov murdered Natasha Lynn Montgomery, a 23-year-old woman who had a young child and was struggling with addiction, becoming the third victim in this series of murders targeting vulnerable women in Prince George. These three women disappeared without triggering the kind of intensive investigation that might have identified a serial killer operating in the area, a failure that reflected broader patterns of how missing and murdered Indigenous women and women involved in sex work and drugs were often treated as low-priority cases. The break in the case came on November 27, 2010, when a conservation officer observed Lichbokov's truck parked suspiciously on a remote logging road near Highway 27. Stopping to investigate and discovering Lichbokov at the scene appearing nervous and providing inconsistent explanations for his presence. The officer noticed what appeared to be blood in Lichbokov's truck and on his clothing, and upon further investigation of the area, discovered the body of Loren Leslie nearby, leading to Lichbokov's immediate arrest. The investigation of Lichbokov and his truck revealed a horrifying amount of evidence, including blood and DNA from multiple victims, personal items belonging to the missing women, and digital evidence from his phone and computer that documented his activities and provided a timeline of the murders. As forensic analysts processed the evidence from the truck, they matched DNA to Stachenko, Moss, and Montgomery, suddenly transforming what appeared to be a single murder case into a serial killer investigation with 4 victims. The discovery that a 20-year-old man had been responsible for 4 murders shocked Prince George and the broader Canadian public, raising questions about how someone so young could commit such crimes and whether there were warning signs that had been missed. Lichbokov's trial began in September 2013, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming forensic evidence linking him to all 4 murders, including DNA evidence from the victims found in his truck and on his clothing, as well as digital evidence showing his movements and activities around the times of the murders. The trial revealed disturbing details about the murders, including evidence that Lichbokov had beaten and sexually assaulted his victims before killing them, and that he had engaged in this behavior over the course of more than a year, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior rather than isolated incidents. Lichbokov testified in his own defense, offering various explanations for how the victim's DNA and belongings ended up in his truck, including claims that he had been present when others committed the murders but had not participated, testimony that the jury clearly did not find credible. On September 11, 2014, Cody Lichbokov was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of Jill Stachenko, Cynthia Moss, Natasha Montgomery, and Loren Leslie, receiving 4 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years, though given his young age, he could potentially be released in his mid-40s if parole is granted. The conviction brought some measure of justice and closure to the families of the victims, though it could not undo the loss or answer all the questions about why these murders occurred and whether earlier intervention might have prevented some of them. The families of Lichbokov's victims delivered powerful victim impact statements describing the devastating loss of their daughters, mothers, and sisters, and the additional pain of knowing they had suffered violence and terror before their deaths. The case highlighted ongoing failures in how Canadian law enforcement responds to missing and murdered Indigenous women and women involved in sex work and drugs, with 3 of Lichbokov's victims having disappeared without triggering the kind of intensive investigation that might have prevented subsequent murders. The fact that Lichbokov was able to kill 4 women over the course of 14 months before being caught by chance when a conservation officer happened to notice his truck on a logging road raised serious questions about whether more proactive policing could have stopped him sooner. The Highway of Tears, a corridor of Highway 16 in northern British Columbia where numerous women have disappeared or been found murdered over decades, runs near Prince George, and Lichbokov's crimes added to the grim statistics of women who have been killed in this region, though his victims were murdered in different locations than the Highway of Tears cases. Cody Lichbokov remains incarcerated serving his life sentences, and given his age, the question of his eventual parole eligibility and potential release remains decades in the future, though victims' families have already indicated they will oppose any parole applications vigorously. The case raised troubling questions about juvenile development and violent crime, as Lichbokov committed his first murder at 19, an age when most people are just beginning adult life and when brain development is not yet complete, yet he engaged in serial murder with a level of violence and planning that suggested sophisticated criminal thinking. Experts who examined Lichbokov found no clear evidence of the kind of severe childhood trauma or abuse that often characterizes serial killers' backgrounds, leaving his motivations and the development of his violent tendencies somewhat mysterious and raising questions about whether some individuals simply develop violent criminal compulsions without clear environmental triggers. The weapons Lichbokov used in his crimes, including a pipe wrench, indicated a level of brutality and overkill that suggested his violence was motivated by more than just a desire to kill but included rage or sadistic enjoyment of inflicting harm. The Lichbokov case contributed to growing pressure on Canadian authorities to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, with the families of his victims and advocates pointing to the case as evidence of how women from marginalized communities are vulnerable to predatory violence, and how their disappearances are not always treated with the urgency they deserve. The trial and conviction received significant media coverage, both for the shocking nature of the crimes and for Lichbokov's youth, prompting broader discussions about serial killers, youth violence, and the vulnerability of women in northern British Columbia communities. The families of Jill Stachenko, Cynthia Moss, Natasha Montgomery, and Loren Leslie have had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones died violently at the hands of a predator. Their suffering compounded by the fact that earlier police action might have prevented some of these deaths if the pattern had been recognized sooner. Number 9. Gilbert Paul Jordan, the boozing barber. Gilbert Paul Jordan operated as a serial killer for over 2 decades in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, earning the grim nickname the boozing barber for his method of murder, which involved forcing vulnerable Indigenous women to consume lethal amounts of alcohol, exploiting both their addiction vulnerabilities and the systemic racism that meant their deaths were often dismissed as accidental rather than investigated as homicides. Born in 1931 in Vancouver, Jordan worked as a barber and appeared to live a conventional life, maintaining a business and interacting normally with customers and neighbors who had no idea about his murderous activities in the city's poorest neighborhood. Between 1965 and 1988, Jordan is believed to have killed at least 8 to 10 women, though the exact number may never be known because many of his victims' deaths were initially ruled accidental or natural, attributed to alcohol poisoning without recognition that they had been deliberately forced to drink by a predator. Jordan specifically targeted Indigenous women struggling with alcoholism and poverty in the downtown Eastside, women whose marginalization made them vulnerable to his predation and whose deaths were unlikely to trigger intensive police investigation in an era when violence against Indigenous women was often dismissed or ignored by authorities. His method was insidious, as he would befriend vulnerable women, offer them money or alcohol, take them to hotel rooms, and then force them to drink lethal quantities of alcohol, often while engaging in sexual activity, a pattern that satisfied both his apparent sexual compulsions and his desire to kill while maintaining a veneer of deniability. The deaths appeared on their face to be alcohol-related accidents, with victims found in hotel rooms having consumed toxic levels of alcohol, and in the context of Vancouver's downtown Eastside where alcohol-related deaths were common, these fatalities did not initially raise red flags for investigators. The first case that began to reveal Jordan's pattern was the death of Vanessa Lee Buckner in October 1987, when witnesses reported seeing Jordan with Buckner shortly before her death and police began to investigate whether her alcohol poisoning had been voluntary or forced. Investigators discovered that Jordan had a history of being present when Indigenous women died of alcohol poisoning, and that in at least one previous case, a woman had survived an encounter with him and reported that he had forced her to drink alcohol against her will, though this complaint had not led to serious charges. On October 11, 1987, police arrested Jordan for the murder of Vanessa Buckner, and the investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of deaths associated with him, leading prosecutors to charge him with manslaughter rather than murder because proving intent and causation in alcohol poisoning deaths presented legal challenges. During the investigation, police found evidence that Jordan had been present at the deaths of multiple women over the years, and witnesses came forward describing his pattern of befriending vulnerable women, taking them to hotels and plying them with alcohol, sometimes forcing them to continue drinking even when they were clearly intoxicated to dangerous levels. The trial revealed that Jordan would sometimes make audio recordings of his encounters with women, capturing their voices as they became increasingly intoxicated and distressed, evidence that provided insight into his motivations and suggested he derived pleasure from controlling and destroying these women. In 1988, Gilbert Jordan was convicted of manslaughter in the death of Vanessa Buckner, receiving a 15-year sentence, though many felt this was inadequate given the evidence that he had killed multiple women using the same method over many years. The conviction brought some measure of accountability for Jordan's crimes, but it could not undo the fact that he had been able to operate for decades, killing vulnerable women whose deaths were not properly investigated because of systemic racism and indifference to the welfare of Indigenous women and poor women struggling with addiction. Jordan served only 6 years of his sentence before being released on parole in 1994, a decision that would prove catastrophic as he immediately resumed his predatory behavior, returning to the downtown Eastside and seeking out vulnerable women. On November 1, 1994, just months after his release, Jordan was present when Edna Shade died of alcohol poisoning in a Vancouver hotel room, with witnesses again reporting that he had been forcing her to drink and that her death followed the same pattern as his previous victims. Jordan was arrested and charged with manslaughter in Shade's death, and in 2000 he was convicted again, receiving a 15-year sentence that was supposed to ensure he would be imprisoned well into old age. The conviction in Shade's death sparked outrage, as it demonstrated that the parole board's decision to release Jordan in 1994 had directly led to another death, raising serious questions about the parole system's ability to assess risk and protect public safety. While Jordan was incarcerated following his conviction for killing Edna Shade, investigators worked to identify other possible victims from his decades of predatory activity, discovering that numerous women had died of alcohol poisoning in circumstances involving Jordan, though legal barriers prevented retroactive prosecution of these cases. The investigation revealed the names of several women whose deaths were now understood to have been murders rather than accidents, including Patricia Andrew, who died in October 1987, and multiple other women who died throughout the 1970s and 1980s while in Jordan's company. The families of these women, many of them Indigenous families who had lost daughters and sisters and who had been told the deaths were accidental, faced the painful revelation that their loved ones had been murdered and that the justice system had failed to recognize and stop the killer. Gilbert Jordan died in prison on July 7, 2006, while serving his sentence for the murder of Edna Shade, ending a life that had been marked by predatory violence targeting the most vulnerable women in Vancouver's poorest neighborhood. His death meant that he would never face additional charges for the other women he had killed, and that many questions about his crimes would never be fully answered, leaving families without complete closure or justice. The Jordan case became a symbol of the systemic failures that allowed violence against Indigenous women to continue with impunity, as his victims' deaths were initially dismissed as accidental because of racist assumptions about Indigenous women and alcohol, allowing him to kill repeatedly without consequence. The case contributed to growing advocacy around missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada, with Jordan's victims cited as examples of how systemic racism and sexism combine to create vulnerability and to prevent proper investigation and accountability when violence occurs. The downtown Eastside neighborhood where Jordan operated remains one of Canada's most impoverished and troubled areas, with high rates of addiction, homelessness, and violence, particularly against women, and Jordan's crimes highlighted how predators exploit these conditions to victimize vulnerable people. The fact that Jordan was able to resume killing immediately after being released from prison in 1994, despite having been convicted of manslaughter and despite the evidence of his pattern of behavior, exposed serious flaws in the parole system and risk assessment processes, leading to calls for reform. The victims of Gilbert Jordan, women like Vanessa Buckner, Edna Shade, and Patricia Andrew, along with others whose deaths may never be fully investigated or acknowledged, deserve to be remembered not as statistics or cautionary tales, but as individuals whose lives mattered and whose deaths should have been prevented by a system that instead failed them repeatedly. The Jordan case demonstrated how serial killers can operate for decades when their victims are marginalized people whose deaths are not taken seriously, and when methods of murder can be disguised as natural or accidental causes, allowing predators to hide in plain sight. The audio recordings Jordan made of some of his victims as they were dying revealed a sadistic dimension to his crimes, suggesting his motivation was not just to kill but to control and derive pleasure from the process of causing death, a psychological profile that should have resulted in his being designated a dangerous offender who would never be released. Gilbert Jordan's legacy is one of systemic failure, as his decades of crimes exposed how racism, sexism, poverty, and indifference to the welfare of vulnerable populations can create conditions where serial predators operate with impunity, killing the invisible and forgotten members of society without facing justice. Number 10. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich, the thrill kill duo. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich represented a new and particularly disturbing type of serial killer, affluent young men who murdered not out of obvious need or compulsion but apparently for the thrill of killing, targeting random strangers and meticulously planning how to dispose of bodies using an incinerator that Millard had purchased, creating a partnership in murder that shocked Canada when it was exposed in 2013. Dellen Millard was born into significant privilege on August 30, 1985, the heir to a wealthy Toronto area family that owned Millard Air, a successful aviation company, giving him access to money, property, and resources that most people could never imagine. Yet despite these advantages, he developed into a cold-blooded killer. Mark Smich, born on August 11, 1987, came from a more modest background but became close friends with Millard, and together they would embark on a series of crimes that culminated in at least 3 murders between 2012 and 2013. The first victim was Laura Babcock, a 23-year-old woman from Toronto who had been involved in a romantic relationship with Millard and who was last seen on June 26, 2012, disappearing without a trace in circumstances that would not be fully understood until years later. Babcock's disappearance was reported by her family, but investigators struggled to develop leads, unaware that she had been murdered and her body completely destroyed in an incinerator, leaving no physical remains to be found. On November 10, 2012, Millard's father, Wayne Millard, was found dead at the family's Toronto area home from a gunshot wound that was initially ruled a suicide, as Wayne had been known to struggle with depression and had access to firearms, though this ruling would later be called into question. On May 6, 2013, Millard and Smich committed the murder that would ultimately expose their crimes when they killed 32-year-old Tim Bosma, a husband and father from Ancaster, Ontario, who was selling his truck online and had the misfortune to allow Millard and Smich to test drive the vehicle. Tim Bosma left his home with 2 men who had responded to his online advertisement for his black Dodge Ram pickup truck, telling his wife he would be back soon after taking the prospective buyers on a test drive. But he never returned, sparking an immediate search when his wife realized something was wrong. The disappearance of Tim Bosma triggered a massive public response, with his wife Charlene making emotional appeals for information and thousands of people sharing his picture and details of his disappearance on social media, creating pressure on police to solve the case quickly. Investigators traced the email communications about the truck purchase and identified Dellen Millard as one of the men who had been with Bosma on the test drive, leading them to investigate Millard and discover he had recently purchased a large incinerator that he called the Eliminator, ostensibly for his aviation business, but which was now suspected of having a more sinister purpose. On May 10, 2013, police arrested Dellen Millard and Mark Smich on charges of forcible confinement and theft of the truck, and as the investigation progressed, these charges were upgraded to first-degree murder when evidence revealed that Bosma had been shot and his body burned in the incinerator. The investigation of Millard and his properties revealed disturbing evidence, including the incinerator containing bone fragments and ash that were later confirmed through DNA testing to be Tim Bosma's remains, as well as the stolen truck hidden on one of Millard's properties. As police delved deeper into Millard's activities, they discovered evidence suggesting he had killed before, leading them to reopen the Laura Babcock missing persons case and to re-examine the death of Wayne Millard, both of which would eventually result in additional murder charges. The investigation revealed that Millard had purchased the incinerator months before Tim Bosma's murder, suggesting premeditation and planning for a method to completely dispose of bodies, and that he had researched incineration methods and temperatures needed to destroy human remains. Text messages and communications between Millard and Smitch revealed they had discussed the murders, shared details about the crimes, and appeared to show no remorse, instead treating the killings as adventures or accomplishments, a chilling indication of their psychological state. In 2016, Dellen Millard and Mark Smitch were tried for the first-degree murder of Tim Bosma, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence including forensic evidence from the incinerator, communications between the defendants discussing the murder, and testimony about their activities in the days before and after Bosma's death. On June 17, 2016, both Millard and Smitch were convicted of first-degree murder in Tim Bosma's death, receiving mandatory life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years, bringing some measure of justice to the Bosma family, though it could never bring Tim back. The conviction was followed by additional trials as prosecutors pursued murder charges in the deaths of Laura Babcock and Wayne Millard, seeking to hold Millard accountable for all his victims and to bring closure to additional families. In 2017, Millard and Smitch were tried for the murder of Laura Babcock, with evidence including text messages showing Millard discussing wanting to get rid of Babcock because she had become a problem in his personal life, and forensic evidence from the incinerator containing traces of her remains. On December 8, 2017, both Millard and Smitch were convicted of first-degree murder in Laura Babcock's death, receiving additional life sentences to be served consecutively to their sentences for the Bosma murder, ensuring both would serve at least 50 years before being eligible for parole. In 2018, Dellen Millard was tried alone for the murder of his father Wayne Millard, with prosecutors arguing that he had killed his father to gain control of the family business and assets, shooting him in the head and staging the scene to appear as suicide. On June 19, 2018, Millard was convicted of first-degree murder in his father's death, receiving a third consecutive life sentence, meaning he would have to serve 75 years before being eligible for parole, effectively a life sentence given that he would be over 100 years old at that point. The three convictions meant that Dellen Millard would spend the rest of his natural life in prison, with no realistic possibility of ever being released, while Mark Smitch, convicted of 2 murders, would have to serve 50 years before parole eligibility, making him an elderly man before he could even be considered for release. The Millard and Smitch case shocked Canadians not only because of the brutality of the murders but because of the apparent randomness of victim selection and the fact that the killers came from circumstances where they had no obvious need to commit crimes, instead appearing to kill for the thrill or excitement. Tim Bosma's murder, in particular, resonated with the public because it demonstrated the vulnerability of ordinary people engaging in common activities like selling a vehicle online, bringing home the reality that anyone could become a victim of random violence. The Bosma family became advocates for victims' rights and public safety, with Tim's wife Charlene speaking eloquently about the impact of his loss on their family and their young daughter who would grow up without her father. The investigation and trials revealed that Millard had lived a double life, maintaining a public persona as a successful businessman and social figure, while secretly engaging in theft, violence, and murder, fooling friends and family who had no idea about his criminal activities. The use of the incinerator to completely destroy bodies represented a level of premeditation and planning that was particularly chilling, as it showed Millard had not just impulsively committed murder but had prepared in advance for how to dispose of evidence and avoid detection. Mark Smitch's participation in the murders raised questions about how he had become involved in Millard's crimes, whether he had been a willing and equal partner or had been influenced or coerced by Millard, though the courts ultimately found him culpable and deserving of murder convictions. The fact that the murders only came to light because Tim Bosma's family and community raised such a public outcry raised troubling questions about whether Laura Babcock's murder would have ever been solved if not for the subsequent investigation into Bosma's death, highlighting how some victims' cases receive more attention than others. Dellen Millard and Mark Smitch remain incarcerated in separate facilities serving their life sentences, with both having lost appeals of their convictions and facing the reality of spending the rest of their lives in prison. The families of Tim Bosma, Laura Babcock, and Wayne Millard have had to endure not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the trauma of learning the horrific details of their deaths through trial testimony and media coverage. The Millard and Smitch case demonstrated that serial killers can emerge from any background, that wealth and privilege are no barrier to the development of murderous impulses, and that the most dangerous predators can be those who appear normal and successful on the surface. The case also highlighted the importance of public engagement and social media in modern criminal investigations, as the Bosma family's appeals for help generated thousands of tips and kept pressure on police to solve the case quickly. The consecutive life sentences imposed on Millard, totaling 75 years before parole eligibility, represented one of the harshest sentences ever imposed in Canadian criminal history, though many felt that even this was insufficient given the calculated, cold-blooded nature of his crimes. The Eliminator incinerator that Millard used to destroy his victims' bodies became a symbol of the calculated evil of his crimes, representing not just the murders themselves but the methodical planning involved in trying to make his victims disappear completely as if they had never existed. The Millard and Smitch case remains one of Canada's most disturbing serial killer cases of the modern era, shocking in its apparent randomness, its cold calculation, and its reminder that monsters can hide behind facades of wealth, success, and normalcy, preying on innocent victims who had no way to recognize the danger they faced.